Imagine living in a time when the Catholic Church, an institution that routinely sanctioned burning heretics alive, breaking people on the wheel, and subjecting suspected witches to systematic torture until they confessed or died, suddenly encountered 5 torture devices so horrifically brutal that even the most hardline church authorities declared them too extreme for Christian use and formally banned them from all territories under ecclesiastical control. This wasn't an institution known for squeamishness about violence. The medieval church had blessed countless executions, provided theological justification for the Crusades, and operated the Inquisition with its elaborate torture chambers and systematic persecution of dissidents. Yet these 5 devices were so unimaginably cruel, so fundamentally opposed to any concept of human dignity or divine mercy, that they forced church leaders to confront the possibility that some forms of torture were so evil that they corrupted not just their victims, but everyone who witnessed or participated in their use, threatening the very souls of Christian society itself. The first device that horrified the church into issuing formal condemnation was the Cradle of Judas, an evolution of the traditional Judas chair that incorporated elements of prolonged sexual torture and systematic psychological breakdown that church authorities recognized as serving no purpose other than pure sadistic gratification. Unlike conventional torture devices that were designed to extract confessions or punish specific crimes, the Cradle of Judas was engineered specifically to destroy the victim's sense of human dignity and spiritual connection to God through methods that church scholars determined were incompatible with Christian concepts of justice and redemption. The device consisted of a pyramid-shaped seat surrounded by additional torture implements that could be activated in sequence, creating a prolonged ordeal that could last for weeks, while systematically destroying every aspect of the victim's physical, psychological, and spiritual well-being. Church authorities were particularly disturbed by reports that victims of the Cradle of Judas often emerged from their ordeals completely unable to participate in religious activities or maintain faith in divine mercy, suggesting that the device was actually effective at destroying souls rather than simply punishing bodies. The second device that prompted ecclesiastical intervention was the Heretic's Symphony, a torture chamber that had been designed to accommodate multiple victims simultaneously, while using their combined screams to create musical compositions that spectators could enjoy as entertainment. Church authorities were horrified, not just by the systematic nature of the torture, but by the way it transformed human suffering into aesthetic pleasure, creating what they recognized as a form of demonic inversion of divine creation that turned agony into beauty. The device incorporated sophisticated acoustic engineering that could modulate and harmonize the cries of up to 12 victims being tortured simultaneously, creating complex musical arrangements that masked the reality of human suffering while providing entertainment for audiences who might not realize they were listening to the sounds of systematic torture. The Church's condemnation focused specifically on the way the device corrupted both operators and spectators by making them unwitting participants in celebration of human suffering disguised as artistic achievement. The third device banned by church authorities was the Soul Crusher, a compression torture device that had been designed not just to break bones and crush organs, but to create specific patterns of internal damage that would destroy the victim's ability to experience spiritual emotions or maintain connection to religious faith. Church scholars who studied the device's effects reported that survivors showed complete inability to experience religious ecstasy, divine revelation, or spiritual comfort, suggesting that the torture had somehow damaged the neurological and psychological foundations of religious experience itself. The device incorporated medical knowledge about the relationship between physical trauma and emotional capacity that allowed operators to target specific areas of the brain and nervous system that governed spiritual sensation and religious feeling. Church authorities recognized that a torture method capable of destroying the soul's capacity for divine connection represented a form of spiritual murder that was fundamentally incompatible with Christian beliefs about redemption and the immortality of the human spirit. The fourth device that prompted church condemnation was the damnation engine, an elaborate torture system that forced victims to participate in their own systematic destruction through choices that would compromise their moral integrity and spiritual salvation, regardless of which options they selected. The device presented victims with series of impossible moral dilemmas, where every available choice would result in additional torture for themselves or innocent family members, creating psychological conditions that would force them to violate their deepest moral convictions in order to minimize overall suffering. Church authorities recognized that the device was designed not just to inflict physical pain, but to deliberately corrupt the victim's soul by forcing them to commit sins that would damn them eternally, according to Christian theology. The systematic destruction of moral agency and the deliberate creation of spiritual corruption were seen as forms of evil that exceeded the legitimate purposes of earthly justice and entered the realm of supernatural malevolence that threatened the cosmic order itself. The fifth and most horrifying device that prompted immediate church intervention was the blasphemy machine, a torture device that forced victims to participate in systematic desecration of Christian symbols and sacraments while being subjected to physical torture that would intensify if they refused to comply with demands for religious sacrilege. The device incorporated mechanisms that would force victims to destroy crucifixes, consume consecrated communion wafers mixed with human waste, and recite prayers that inverted traditional Christian liturgy into demonic invocations. Church authorities were horrified not just by the physical torture, but by the way the device forced victims to participate in their own spiritual damnation, while creating systematic desecration of sacred objects and rituals that threatened the spiritual integrity of the entire Christian community. The systematic corruption of religious symbols and the forced participation in blasphemous acts were seen as attacks on the divine order that required immediate ecclesiastical intervention to prevent spiritual contamination of Christian society. The theological arguments that led to these unprecedented church bans reveal how even an institution comfortable with extreme violence had moral and spiritual boundaries that certain torture devices could violate, forcing church scholars to develop new categories of evil that distinguish between legitimate punishment and supernatural corruption. Church authorities argued that these 5 devices crossed the line from temporal justice into spiritual warfare, representing forms of systematic evil that served Satan's purposes rather than God's will, even when employed against criminals and heretics who deserved punishment. The theological framework that emerged from these condemnations established principles about the relationship between physical torture and spiritual corruption that influenced Christian thinking about justice and punishment for centuries afterward. The Church's position was that torture devices which destroyed souls, rather than simply punishing bodies, represented forms of evil that corrupted everyone who came into contact with them, making them too dangerous for use in Christian society, regardless of the crimes they were intended to punish. The practical enforcement of these church bans created unprecedented challenges for secular authorities who had invested enormous resources in constructing and implementing these ultimate torture devices, forcing them to choose between ecclesiastical approval and their preferred methods of social control. The Church's condemnation carried significant political weight because it implied that rulers who continued to use these devices were serving demonic rather than divine purposes, potentially undermining the theological foundations of royal authority and legitimacy. Some secular authorities attempted to continue using the banned devices in secret, but church investigators developed sophisticated methods for detecting their use and exposing violations of the ecclesiastical prohibition. The enforcement mechanisms included excommunication of operators, interdiction of territories where banned devices were used, and public denunciation of rulers who failed to comply with church directives. The international impact of these church bans influenced legal systems and torture practices throughout Christian Europe, demonstrating how ecclesiastical authority could override secular preferences when religious leaders determined that certain practices threatened the spiritual welfare of Christian society. Foreign rulers, who wanted to maintain good relationships with the church, were forced to abandon torture devices that they had found effective. While diplomatic negotiations sometimes included discussions of torture practices and compliance with church directives regarding banned devices. The bans also influenced the development of international law and diplomatic customs that recognized certain forms of torture as unacceptable, even in an era when extreme violence was routinely employed for political and judicial purposes. The Church's position established precedents that would later influence humanitarian law and international agreements about acceptable limits on torture and punishment. The economic consequences of the church bans were substantial, as authorities who had invested in constructing these ultimate torture devices found themselves unable to use equipment that had cost the equivalent of major public works projects. The specialized craftsmen, medical personnel, and operational staff who had been trained to operate these devices suddenly found their expertise rendered worthless by ecclesiastical prohibition, creating unemployment and economic disruption in communities that had developed around the torture industry. Some authorities attempted to recoup their investments by selling banned devices to foreign buyers, but the Church's condemnation made such sales politically risky and diplomatically problematic. The economic impact extended beyond direct costs to include the disruption of legal systems that had been designed around the use of these specific torture methods for extracting confessions and maintaining social control. The technological innovations that had made these devices possible represent some of the most sophisticated applications of engineering, medical knowledge, and psychological research to the problem of systematic torture, demonstrating how intellectual advancement could be corrupted to serve the darkest aspects of human nature when moral constraints were abandoned. The devices incorporated cutting-edge understanding of human anatomy, neurological function, and psychological manipulation that could have been applied to beneficial purposes, but were instead dedicated entirely to perfecting human suffering in ways that exceeded all previous concepts of cruelty. The engineering sophistication required for acoustic modulation, precise compression control, and systematic psychological manipulation represented genuine technological achievements that were corrupted by their application to torture rather than healing or construction. The documentation and study of these banned devices created extensive archives that provide disturbing insights into how systematic torture had become a form of institutional science with its own research methodologies and professional standards, while also revealing the limits that even torture specialists recognized when confronted with devices that exceeded acceptable boundaries of human cruelty. Church scholars who studied the device's effects produced detailed reports describing their impact on victims, operators, and communities, creating a body of literature that influenced theological thinking about the nature of evil and the relationship between physical and spiritual corruption. These studies contributed to broader understanding of how extreme torture could affect not just individual victims, but entire societies that permitted or witnessed such systematic cruelty. The resistance movements that developed in response to these ultimate torture devices reveal how some individuals and communities recognized their fundamental evil and worked to oppose their use despite significant personal risks and potential punishment from authorities who wanted to continue employing them. Underground networks provided assistance to potential victims while documenting the device's effects and building support for church intervention. While some secular officials secretly cooperated with ecclesiastical investigators, despite political pressure to maintain effective torture capabilities. The resistance efforts demonstrated that even in societies that routinely practiced extreme violence, certain forms of systematic cruelty could exceed the tolerance of conscience-driven individuals who were willing to risk their safety to oppose practices they recognized as fundamentally evil. The psychological impact on communities where these devices were used provides evidence of their broader corrupting effects that extended far beyond their immediate victims to influence the moral and spiritual health of entire societies. Church authorities documented increases in violence, mental illness, and social dysfunction in areas where the banned devices had been employed, suggesting that exposure to such extreme torture created psychological conditions that encouraged additional cruelty and moral breakdown. The systematic corruption of social relationships and community values was seen as evidence that these devices served demonic purposes that threatened the spiritual foundations of Christian civilization, rather than simply providing effective methods for punishment and social control. The eventual destruction of these banned devices required elaborate ceremonial procedures that church authorities developed to ensure that their elimination would be complete and that any spiritual contamination associated with their use would be properly cleansed from Christian society. The destruction ceremonies incorporated elements of exorcism and purification that treated the devices as instruments of supernatural evil rather than simply misguided applications of temporal authority. While the sites where they had been used were subjected to elaborate cleansing rituals designed to remove any lingering spiritual corruption. The Church's approach to eliminating these devices demonstrated how seriously ecclesiastical authorities took the threat they represented to Christian society and the cosmic order itself. Perhaps most disturbing of all is how the history of these church-banned torture devices reveals the extraordinary human capacity for creating innovations that serve no legitimate purpose other than causing systematic suffering while corrupting everyone who comes into contact with them, demonstrating that certain forms of technological advancement can represent pure evil rather than progress or achievement. The fact that devices could be so fundamentally evil that even an institution comfortable with extreme violence would ban them provides both a warning about the potential for human innovation to serve the darkest aspects of human nature and evidence that moral boundaries can sometimes emerge even within systems dedicated to systematic cruelty when confronted with practices that exceed all acceptable limits of human behavior. What do you think about this absolutely terrifying demonstration of how technological innovation could create torture devices so fundamentally evil that even the medieval church, an institution that routinely sanctioned extreme violence, recognized them as threats to the spiritual welfare of Christian society itself? Can you imagine torture methods so systematically corrupting that they could destroy not just bodies, but souls, making them too dangerous for use even against criminals and heretics who deserved punishment? The fact that ecclesiastical authorities were willing to override secular preferences and ban devices that rulers found effective really makes you wonder about the moral limits that can emerge even within institutions dedicated to systematic violence when confronted with practices that exceed all boundaries of acceptable human behavior, doesn't it? Share your thoughts in the comments about what this reveals about the relationship between technological capability and moral responsibility, and whether contemporary institutions might be developing practices that exceed acceptable limits despite their claimed legitimacy. If you found this investigation into torture devices so brutal that even the medieval church banned them as disturbing and thought-provoking as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more shocking revelations about the historical tension between technological advancement and moral boundaries. Ring that notification bell because our next deep dive will explore another example of how moral limits can emerge even within systems dedicated to systematic cruelty when confronted with practices that threaten the spiritual and psychological foundations of civilization itself. Trust me, these stories will change how you think about the relationship between innovation and human dignity forever.